In the scorching summer of 1867, when the American frontier was painted red with blood and the clash of two worlds, a young woman named Martha Collins learned that sometimes the line between life and death is as thin as a single breath held too long. What began as a routine journey west with her family's wagon train would end with her lying motionless among the bodies of everyone she loved, listening to war cries echo across the Nebraska plains, while Cheyenne warriors celebrated their victory just feet away from where she lay. For 3 days and 2 nights, Martha would remain perfectly still among the dead, her body growing weak from thirst and her mind fracturing from the horror of what she had witnessed. But it wasn't the attack itself that would change the course of her life forever. It was the moment when exhaustion finally broke her resolve, when a barely audible whisper escaped her lips, and when the most feared war chief of the Northern Cheyenne heard that whisper and made a decision that would challenge everything both of their peoples believed about mercy, survival, and what it truly means to be human in a world gone mad with violence. This is the story of how Martha Collins died with her family on the Oregon Trail, and how she was reborn into a world she never knew existed. Martha Collins had never seen a sunrise quite like the one that painted the Nebraska sky on July 15, 1867. Streaks of orange and pink stretched across the endless prairie, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe that this beautiful morning was a good omen for the journey ahead. She stood beside her family's covered wagon, watching the other families in their train prepare for another day of westward travel, unaware that this would be the last sunrise she would witness as the person she had always been. The Collins family had joined the wagon train in Independence, Missouri, 6 weeks earlier. Like so many other families during that turbulent period of American expansion, they were seeking a fresh start in the Oregon Territory. Martha's father, Samuel Collins, had lost his farm to debt after the Civil War ended, and the promise of free land in the West seemed like their only hope for rebuilding their lives. Martha, at 22 years old, had been reluctant to leave the familiar comforts of Missouri, but she understood that her family had little choice. Samuel was a practical man with weathered hands and a gentle disposition that had served him well as a farmer, but poorly as a businessman. Martha's mother, Elizabeth, was a woman of quiet strength who had learned to make the best of any situation life presented. Martha's younger brother, Thomas, was 16 and filled with the kind of adventurous spirit that made the dangers of the frontier seem exciting rather than terrifying. Her younger sister, Sarah, was only 12 years old and spent most of her time reading books and sketching pictures of the landscapes they passed. The wagon train consisted of 27 families, led by an experienced guide named Captain James Morrison. Morrison was a former Army scout who had made the journey to Oregon Territory more than a dozen times. He was known for his ability to navigate the treacherous terrain and his skill in negotiating with the various Native American tribes they might encounter along the way. Most of the families trusted him completely, believing that his experience would see them safely to their destination. As the sun climbed higher that morning, Martha helped her mother prepare breakfast over their small cooking fire. The smell of bacon and coffee mixed with the sounds of children playing and men discussing the day's travel plans. It was a scene that had become routine over the past 6 weeks, and Martha found comfort in the familiar rhythms of wagon train life. She had even begun to look forward to the daily challenges and the sense of community that had developed among the travelers. The landscape around them had been gradually changing as they moved farther west. The rolling hills and forests of Missouri had given way to vast stretches of prairie grass that seemed to extend forever in every direction. Occasionally, they would see herds of buffalo in the distance, dark masses moving across the horizon like storm clouds. Martha had been amazed by the sheer size of these herds and the thunderous sound their hooves made when they ran. Captain Morrison had warned them repeatedly about the dangers they might face. The threat of Indian attacks was always present, but he had explained that most tribes were more interested in avoiding conflict than seeking it. He told them about the importance of maintaining discipline, keeping the wagons in formation, and never traveling alone. He had also taught them to recognize the signs of potential trouble, such as unusual smoke signals or the sudden disappearance of wildlife from an area. Despite these warnings, life on the trail had been relatively peaceful. They had encountered several groups of Native Americans, but these meetings had been limited to trading opportunities rather than confrontations. The Indians had been interested in exchanging goods like beads, metal tools, and cloth for food and other supplies. Martha had been fascinated by these encounters, studying the intricate beadwork on their clothing and observing their skilled horsemanship. Thomas had been particularly excited by these meetings. He had spent hours practicing with his rifle and dreaming of the adventures he might have once they reached Oregon Territory. He often talked about becoming a scout, like Captain Morrison, learning to live off the land and navigate by the stars. Martha worried about her brother's romantic notions of frontier life, but she admired his courage and optimism. Sarah, on the other hand, had found the journey difficult. She missed her friends back home and the comfort of their old house. She spent most of her time inside the wagon, reading books that she had brought from Missouri and writing in her diary. Martha often sat with her younger sister during the long hours of travel, listening to her read passages from her favorite novels, and looking at the detailed sketches she made of the people and places they encountered. Elizabeth Collins had adapted to life on the trail, with characteristic resilience. She had learned to cook over an open fire, to mend clothes and equipment that was constantly being damaged by the rough conditions, and to provide comfort and encouragement to her family during the most challenging moments. She had also become something of a leader among the women in the wagon train, organizing communal activities and helping to resolve disputes when they arose. Samuel had taken on the responsibilities of caring for their oxen and maintaining their wagon. He had quickly learned the importance of checking the wheels and axles every morning, of monitoring the health of their animals, and of keeping their supplies properly secured. He had also volunteered to stand guard duty on a rotating basis with the other men, spending long hours at night watching for signs of danger while the rest of the train slept. As they prepared to continue their journey that morning, Martha felt a strange sense of unease that she couldn't quite explain. The prairie around them seemed unusually quiet, and she noticed that Captain Morrison appeared more alert and watchful than usual. When she mentioned her concerns to her mother, Elizabeth told her that it was natural to feel nervous as they entered less familiar territory. The wagon train began moving shortly after 8 o'clock, following the well-worn ruts of the Oregon Trail across the Nebraska prairie. Martha walked alongside their wagon for the first few hours, enjoying the morning air and the company of other women from the train. They talked about their hopes for their new lives in Oregon Territory, sharing stories about the families they had left behind and the challenges they hoped to overcome. Around midday, Captain Morrison called for a brief halt near a small creek to allow the animals to drink and the families to prepare their noon meal. Martha helped her mother unpack their food supplies while Thomas and Sarah explored the creek bank, looking for interesting rocks and plants. Samuel joined the other men in checking their equipment and discussing the afternoon's travel route. It was during this peaceful interlude that Martha first noticed the riders on the distant hills. They appeared as small, dark shapes against the sky, too far away to identify clearly but close enough to attract attention. When she pointed them out to her father, Samuel studied them through a small telescope that Captain Morrison had lent him. "Probably just a hunting party," Samuel told his family, trying to keep any concern out of his voice. "Captain Morrison says it's normal to see Indians in this area. They're probably just curious about our movements." But Martha noticed that Captain Morrison himself seemed less confident about the distant riders than her father suggested. The guide spent considerable time studying the horizon through his own telescope, and she saw him having hushed conversations with several of the other men. As the afternoon progressed, the riders seemed to be maintaining a parallel course to the wagon train, sometimes disappearing behind hills or ridges, but always reappearing in roughly the same relative position. The afternoon hours passed slowly, with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to affect the entire train. Children were called closer to their families' wagons, and conversations became more subdued. Martha found herself frequently scanning the horizon, looking for the mysterious riders who continued to shadow their progress. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Captain Morrison made the decision to circle the wagons for the night near a small grove of cottonwood trees. This was earlier than they usually stopped, and Martha knew that the guide was taking extra precautions because of the riders they had observed. The families quickly set about their evening routines, but Martha noticed that the men were taking more time to check their weapons and that extra guards were being posted around the perimeter of their camp. That evening, as the Collins family gathered around their cooking fire for what would be their last meal together, Martha tried to push away her feelings of apprehension. Her mother had prepared a simple but satisfying dinner of beans, bacon, and bread, and Thomas entertained them with stories about the wildlife he had observed during the day's travel. Sarah showed them new sketches she had made of the prairie landscape, and Samuel discussed his plans for their farm once they reached Oregon Territory. Despite the normalcy of their conversation, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change dramatically. The riders they had seen during the day had vanished as darkness fell, but she sensed that they were still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. As she helped her mother clean their dishes and prepare for the night, she found herself memorizing details about her family members, studying their faces in the firelight as if she might never see them again. The last thing Martha remembered about that evening was lying in her bedroll inside their wagon, listening to the sounds of the prairie night and the quiet conversations of the men on guard duty. Sarah was sleeping peacefully beside her, and she could hear the steady breathing of her parents from the other end of the wagon. Thomas had volunteered to take a turn at guard duty, and she could occasionally see his silhouette moving past the wagon opening. As she drifted off to sleep, Martha thought about the letter she planned to write to her best friend back in Missouri once they reached Oregon territory. She wanted to describe the incredible vastness of the prairie, the brilliant colors of the western sunsets, and the sense of adventure that had gradually replaced her initial reluctance about making this journey. She had no way of knowing that she would never write that letter, and that by the next sunset, everything she had ever known about herself and her place in the world would be forever changed. The attack began just as the first pale light of dawn was beginning to creep across the eastern horizon. Martha was awakened not by the sound of gunshots or war cries, but by an eerie silence that seemed to have settled over the entire wagon train camp. The normal sounds of early morning preparation were absent, replaced by a stillness that made her skin crawl with inexplicable dread. She lay perfectly still in her bedroll for several moments, trying to understand what had awakened her. Sarah was still sleeping peacefully beside her, and she could hear her parents breathing quietly at the other end of their wagon. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of wind rustling through the prairie grass. Something was terribly wrong, but Martha couldn't identify exactly what it was. Slowly, carefully, she raised herself up just enough to peer through a small gap in the wagon's canvas cover. What she saw made her blood freeze in her veins. The guards who should have been walking the perimeter of their camp were nowhere to be seen. The cooking fires that had been banked for the night were cold and dead. Most disturbing of all, she could see what appeared to be motionless forms lying on the ground near several of the other wagons. Before she could process what she was seeing, the silence was shattered by a sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The war cry of Cheyenne warriors erupted from all sides of their camp simultaneously, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Within seconds, the peaceful wagon train camp was transformed into a scene of absolute chaos and terror. Martha watched in horror as dozens of Cheyenne warriors emerged from the prairie grass where they had been lying in wait throughout the night. They had crawled close to the circled wagons under cover of darkness, systematically eliminating the guards without making a sound. Now they rose like spirits from the earth itself, their faces painted for war, their weapons gleaming in the early morning light. The attack was swift and merciless. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, striking down anyone who emerged from the wagons before they could fully understand what was happening. Martha saw Captain Morrison stumble from his wagon, reaching for his rifle, only to fall with a Cheyenne lance through his chest. She watched family she had come to know and care about over the past 6 weeks cut down without mercy or hesitation. Samuel Collins had been sleeping closest to the wagon opening and was the first member of Martha's family to react to the attack. He grabbed his rifle and pushed past his wife and daughters, trying to defend his family even though he could see that resistance was hopeless. Martha watched her father emerge from their wagon and immediately faced 3 Cheyenne warriors who had surrounded their position. "Stay down," Samuel shouted back to his family as he tried to bring his rifle to bear. "Stay inside the wagon and don't make any noise." But his words were cut short as a tomahawk struck him in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground beside their wagon. Elizabeth Collins screamed her husband's name and tried to rush to his aid, but Martha grabbed her mother's arm and held her back. Through the gap in the canvas, she could see that Samuel was already beyond help, his body lying motionless in the dirt. Thomas, awakened by the sounds of battle, grabbed his own rifle and tried to follow his father's example. Despite his youth and inexperience, he showed remarkable courage as he attempted to defend his family. Martha watched her 16-year-old brother emerge from the wagon with his weapon raised, his face showing determination rather than fear. But courage alone was not enough against experienced warriors, and Thomas fell within moments of leaving the wagon's protection. The attack continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably no more than 15 or 20 minutes. The Cheyenne warriors moved methodically from wagon to wagon, killing anyone they found and taking anything of value. Martha held her mother and Sarah close to her, all 3 women lying as flat as possible against the wagon floor, trying to become invisible. Elizabeth Collins had stopped screaming after watching her husband and son die, but Martha could feel her mother's body shaking with silent sobs. Sarah had gone completely silent, her eyes wide with shock and terror. Martha knew that their only hope of survival was to remain absolutely quiet and hope that the warriors would not search their wagon thoroughly. She could hear the sounds of destruction all around them. Wagon covers were being ripped away, supplies were being dumped and sorted through, and occasionally she would hear the voices of the warriors as they called to each other in their own language. The sounds of screaming and gunfire had largely stopped, replaced by the more methodical noises of a victorious war party claiming their spoils. At one point, Martha heard footsteps approaching their wagon. She pressed her face against the wooden floor and held her breath, praying that whoever was outside would move on without investigating further. She could hear someone moving around their wagon, probably looking at the supplies that Samuel had stacked outside the night before. After what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, and Martha allowed herself to breathe again. As the morning progressed, the sounds of activity gradually diminished. Martha could hear the warriors gathering horses and loading captured supplies onto pack animals. Occasionally, there would be a brief conversation in the Cheyenne language, but for the most part, the war party seemed to be working in organized silence. She began to hope that they might actually survive if they could remain hidden until the warriors departed. But their hiding place was discovered late in the morning when a warrior decided to search their wagon more thoroughly. Martha heard the canvas cover being pulled back, and suddenly bright sunlight was streaming into their hiding place. She looked up to see a young Cheyenne warrior staring down at them, his face painted with red and black stripes, his eyes showing no emotion whatsoever. For a long moment, the warrior simply looked at them. As if deciding what to do, Martha held her mother and sister closer, expecting to die at any second. But instead of attacking them immediately, the warrior called out to his companions in the Cheyenne language. Within moments, several other warriors had gathered around their wagon, looking down at the three surviving women. What followed was a rapid conversation in the Cheyenne language that Martha could not understand. She could tell that the warriors were debating what to do with them, but she had no way of knowing whether they were discussing execution, captivity, or some other fate. All she could do was hold her family close and wait for their decision. The debate ended when an older warrior, apparently a leader, approached their wagon. He looked down at them with eyes that seemed to see everything, studying their faces with an intensity that made Martha feel as if he could read her thoughts. After a moment, he spoke a few words in the Cheyenne language, and Martha was surprised to realize that she recognized some of the words from her previous encounters with Native Americans during their journey. The warriors who had been surrounding their wagon began to disperse, and Martha dared to hope that they might be spared. But her relief was short-lived. The older warrior gestured for them to climb out of the wagon, and Martha knew that their brief reprieve was over. Whatever the warriors had decided to do with them, it would not happen inside the relative safety of their covered wagon. Elizabeth Collins was the first to move, slowly climbing down from the wagon, with as much dignity as she could manage under the circumstances. Sarah followed her mother, her young face pale with terror but her chin raised in defiance. Martha came last, trying to project a courage she did not feel as she faced the warriors who had destroyed her family and her future. Once they were standing beside their wagon, Martha was able to see the full extent of the destruction for the first time. Bodies lay scattered throughout the wagon train camp, and several of the wagons had been set on fire. The oxen and horses had been rounded up and were being prepared for transport. Personal belongings that the warriors considered worthless were scattered across the ground like discarded memories. The three women were led to the center of the camp, where other survivors had been gathered. Martha was surprised to see that they were not the only ones who had been spared. There were perhaps a dozen other people, mostly women and children, sitting under guard near one of the burned wagons. She recognized several faces from their traveling companions, but she also noticed the absence of many others who she knew had been part of their wagon train. Among the survivors was Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman whose husband had been the wagon train's blacksmith. There was also young Billy Morrison, Captain Morrison's 10-year-old son, and three of the Henderson children, whose parents had apparently been killed in the attack. The survivors sat in stunned silence, too shocked to speak and too frightened to move without permission. The older warrior who had discovered them in their wagon spent several minutes walking among the survivors, studying each person carefully. Martha had the impression that he was making decisions about their individual fates, though she could not guess what criteria he was using. When he paused in front of her family, she met his gaze as steadily as she could, trying to show that she was not broken by what had happened to them. After completing his examination of the survivors, the warrior spoke briefly to several of his companions. Martha watched as some of the captives were separated from the others and led away toward the horses. She was relieved to see that her mother and sister were not among those selected, but she was also confused about what this selection process meant for their ultimate fate. The sun was approaching its zenith when the Cheyenne war party began to prepare for departure. The warriors had efficiently stripped the wagon train of everything they considered valuable, including horses, weapons, tools, and food supplies. The survivors who had been selected earlier were being prepared for transport, their hands bound and ropes attached to horses so they could be led away as captives. But Martha and her remaining family members were not among those being prepared for departure. Instead, they remained sitting with several other survivors near the burned wagon, watching as the war party organized itself for travel. Martha began to hope that they might be left behind, allowed to continue their journey or make their way back to civilization somehow. Her hopes were crushed when the older warrior approached their group one final time. He spoke a few words in the Cheyenne language, and several younger warriors moved forward with their weapons ready. Martha realized with stunning clarity that they had not been spared after all. They had simply been saved for last. The executions were carried out quickly and efficiently. Martha watched her mother die first, struck down by a tomahawk blow before she could even cry out. Sarah tried to run but was caught within a few steps and killed just as swiftly. As Martha saw her younger sister fall, something broke inside her mind, and she felt herself becoming detached from what was happening, as if she were watching events unfold from a great distance. When the warrior turned toward her, Martha made a decision that would save her life. Instead of trying to run or fight or plead for mercy, she allowed herself to collapse as if she had fainted from shock and terror. She fell to the ground beside her mother's body and lay perfectly still, controlling her breathing and keeping her eyes closed. Even when she felt the warrior nudging her with his foot, she heard him speak to his companions, and then she felt him checking for signs of life. Martha forced herself to remain completely limp as he lifted her arm and let it fall. She concentrated on slowing her breathing until it was barely perceptible and tried to make her body feel as lifeless as possible. After what seemed like forever, the warrior apparently satisfied himself that she was dead and moved on to complete his grisly work. Martha lay motionless among the bodies of her family and fellow travelers as the Cheyenne war party completed their preparations and departed. She listened to the sounds of horses moving away across the prairie, to the gradual return of silence to the devastated wagon train camp. Only when she was absolutely certain that the warriors were gone did she allow herself to open her eyes and begin the most terrifying ordeal of her life. The silence that followed the departure of the Cheyenne war party was unlike anything Martha had ever experienced. It was not the peaceful quiet of a prairie morning or the comfortable stillness of evening around a campfire. This was the silence of death, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the buzzing of flies that had already begun to gather around, the bodies scattered throughout what had been their wagon train camp. Martha lay motionless beside her mother's corpse for what felt like hours before she dared to open her eyes. When she finally did, the sight that greeted her was so horrific that she immediately understood why her mind had tried to disconnect from reality during the final moments of the attack. The bodies of people she had known and traveled with for 6 weeks lay around her in grotesque positions, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and pain. Her mother, Elizabeth, lay just inches away, her kind eyes staring sightlessly at the Nebraska sky. Blood had pooled beneath her head, staining the prairie grass a dark crimson. Sarah's small body was crumpled nearby, looking even younger and more fragile in death than she had in life. Martha forced herself to look at each member of her family, burned their faces into her memory, and whispered a silent goodbye to the people who had defined her world. The urge to cry was overwhelming, but Martha knew that tears were a luxury she could not afford. She had no way of knowing whether some of the warriors might return, or whether other hostile groups might be in the area. Her survival depended on her ability to remain completely still and silent, no matter what emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She would have time to grieve later, assuming she lived long enough to escape from this place of death. As the afternoon wore on, Martha became increasingly aware of the physical discomfort of her situation. She was lying on hard ground that was becoming increasingly hot under the summer sun. Her body was pressed against her mother's cooling corpse, and the smell of blood and death was becoming more pronounced as time passed. Insects had discovered the bodies and were beginning their grim work, crawling across Martha's face and hands as they moved between the living and the dead. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to get up, to brush away the flies, to move away from the carnage surrounding her. But Martha forced herself to remain motionless, breathing as shallowly as possible and keeping her eyes closed most of the time. When she did open them, it was only to scan the horizon for signs of approaching riders or other potential threats. The sun beat down mercilessly on the exposed prairie, and Martha could feel her body becoming dehydrated. Her lips were already beginning to crack, and her mouth felt like it was filled with sand. She knew that she could not survive for very long without water, but the nearest source was the small creek where they had stopped the day before, and that was several hundred yards away across open ground. As evening approached, Martha faced her first major decision. Should she risk moving during the relative safety of darkness, or should she continue to play dead in case the warriors returned? She had no way of knowing what the normal patterns of behavior were for Cheyenne war parties. Did they sometimes return to battlefields to retrieve items they had missed? Did they post scouts to watch for potential survivors? Her lack of knowledge about Native American customs could easily prove fatal. The decision was made for her when she heard the sound of approaching horses just as the sun was setting. Martha's heart nearly stopped as she recognized the distinctive rhythm of unshod hooves moving across the prairie. Someone was returning to the wagon train camp, and she had to assume it was hostile until proven otherwise. She forced herself to become even more motionless than before, if such a thing was possible. The riders approached slowly, as if they were being cautious about potential threats. Martha could hear at least 3 or 4 horses, and occasionally she could make out voices speaking in what sounded like the Cheyenne language. Through her barely opened eyelids, she could see torches or fires being lit as the newcomers moved through the camp. They were conducting some kind of systematic search of the area. Martha realized that these might not be the same warriors who had conducted the attack. This could be a different group entirely, perhaps scouts from a larger band, or even a burial party sent to deal with their own dead. She had been so focused on the fate of the wagon train survivors that she had not paid attention to whether any of the attacking warriors had been killed or wounded during the battle. The search continued for what seemed like hours. Martha could hear the newcomers moving methodically from wagon to wagon, occasionally calling out to each other in their own language. At one point, she heard what sounded like an argument or heated discussion, but she could not understand what they were debating. She could only lie still and hope that they would not discover that she was still alive. Several times during the night, warriors passed very close to where she lay among the bodies. Once, someone actually stepped over her, and she felt the warrior's foot briefly touch her leg. She forced herself not to react, even though every muscle in her body wanted to tense up in preparation for discovery and death. The warrior paused for a moment, as if something had caught his attention, but then continued on without investigating further. As the hours passed, Martha found herself slipping in and out of a strange state that was neither fully conscious nor completely unconscious. The combination of shock, dehydration, and physical exhaustion was affecting her mind in ways she had never experienced. Sometimes she found herself having conversations with her dead family members, only to realize that she was talking to corpses. Other times she felt as if she were floating above the scene, watching herself lying among the bodies like a detached observer. The sound of the horses finally faded away sometime after midnight, but Martha did not dare to move immediately. She forced herself to wait until she was absolutely certain that the riders were gone, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate their return. Only when she had heard nothing but natural prairie sounds for more than an hour did she finally risk raising her head to look around. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light for her to see the devastation that surrounded her. Bodies lay scattered across the camp like broken dolls, and several of the wagons were still smoldering from the fires that had been set earlier. The scene was like something from a nightmare, and Martha had to fight down a wave of nausea as the full reality of her situation hit her. She was alone in the middle of the Nebraska prairie, hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, with no food, no water, no weapons, and no means of transportation. The clothes she wore were stained with blood, both her own family's and that of strangers. She had no way of knowing which direction led to safety, or whether she would encounter hostile forces if she tried to travel in any direction. But despite the overwhelming nature of her situation, Martha felt a strange sense of relief at being able to move again. She slowly sat up, working the stiffness out of muscles that had been forced to remain motionless for nearly 18 hours. She flexed her fingers and toes, rotated her shoulders, and took several deep breaths of the night air. Simply being able to move freely again felt like a small miracle. Her first priority had to be water. She remembered the location of the small creek where they had stopped the day before, and she thought she could find her way there in the moonlight. The creek was not far, but reaching it would require her to cross open ground where she would be visible to anyone watching. She would have to take that risk because she knew she could not survive much longer without water. Moving as quietly as possible, Martha began to crawl away from the wagon train camp. She stayed low to the ground, using the tall prairie grass for concealment wherever possible. Every few yards she would stop and listen carefully for any sounds that might indicate danger. The night was filled with the normal sounds of the prairie: insects chirping, small animals moving through the grass, and the distant howl of a coyote, but she heard nothing that suggested human presence. The journey to the creek took her nearly an hour. Even though the distance was not great, she had to move slowly and carefully, stopping frequently to rest and to check for potential threats. When she finally reached the water, the relief was overwhelming. She buried her face in the cool stream and drank deeply, feeling the life-giving liquid reviving her parched body. After drinking her fill, Martha used the water to wash the blood and dirt from her face and hands. She also rinsed out her mouth, trying to remove the terrible taste that had been building there throughout her ordeal. The cool water felt wonderful against her skin, and for a few moments she allowed herself to simply enjoy the sensation of being clean again. But even as she savored this small comfort, Martha was acutely aware that her situation remained desperate. She had solved the immediate problem of thirst, but she still had no food, no shelter, no protection, and no clear plan for reaching safety. The night was growing cold, and she realized that she would need to find some kind of shelter before dawn if she hoped to survive another day. She decided to return to the wagon train camp, not because she wanted to spend more time among the bodies of her family and friends, but because there might be supplies there that the warriors had overlooked. Perhaps some food or blankets had been hidden in places that the attackers had not thoroughly searched. She also needed to find better clothing and possibly a weapon of some kind. The journey back to the camp was even more terrifying than the trip to the creek had been. Martha was returning to a place of horror, and she had to fight against every instinct that told her to flee in the opposite direction. But she knew that her survival might depend on whatever resources she could salvage from the wreckage of the wagon train. As she approached the camp, Martha could see that several of the wagons were still burning, casting flickering shadows across the scene of destruction. The sight was so disturbing that she had to stop several times to steady herself before continuing. When she finally reached the edge of the camp, she forced herself to begin a systematic search for anything that might be useful for survival. Working quietly and carefully, Martha searched through the remains of several wagons, looking for items that the warriors might have missed or considered worthless. She found a few pieces of clothing that were not too badly damaged, a small knife that had been dropped or overlooked, and some hardtack that had been scattered on the ground but was still edible. These small discoveries felt like major victories given the desperate nature of her situation. As dawn approached, Martha realized that she would soon need to make another crucial decision. Should she remain in the area and try to signal for help from other travelers who might pass by? Or should she attempt to travel on her own toward what she hoped was safety? Both options carried enormous risks, but staying in one place meant remaining near the scene of the massacre, while traveling alone across the prairie could easily lead to her death from exposure, starvation, or encounters with hostile forces. The decision was made for her when she heard the distant sound of horses approaching once again. Someone was coming, and Martha had no way of knowing whether they represented rescue or another deadly threat. Once again, she would have to make herself invisible among the dead, and hope that her remarkable ability to remain motionless would save her life. The sound of approaching horses reached Martha's ears just as the eastern sky began to show the first pale hints of dawn. She had been searching through the wreckage for supplies, and now she had to make an instant decision about where to hide. The horses were still distant, but they were moving steadily toward the wagon train camp, and she had only moments before they would arrive. Martha quickly gathered the few items she had found and scrambled back to where her family's bodies lay. She positioned herself beside her mother's corpse exactly as she had been lying before, closed her eyes, and forced her breathing to slow to an almost imperceptible rate. The physical and emotional exhaustion of the past day and night actually helped her in this moment, making it easier for her body to appear lifeless. As the riders drew closer, Martha could tell that this was a much smaller group than the war party that had attacked the wagon train. She estimated perhaps 5 or 6 horses, moving at a steady but unhurried pace. Through her barely opened eyelids, she could see torches bobbing in the pre-dawn darkness as the riders entered the camp. The newcomers moved differently than the previous night's visitors had. Where the others had seemed to be conducting a search or investigation, these riders appeared to be looking for something specific. They spoke to each other in low voices, and Martha could make out enough of their words to realize that they were speaking in the Cheyenne language. But the tone was different from what she had heard during the attack. One of the riders dismounted near where Martha lay and began walking slowly among the bodies. She could hear his footsteps approaching, and she forced herself to remain perfectly still as he passed within inches of her position. The warrior paused several times, and Martha had the terrifying thought that he might be checking to see if anyone had survived the massacre. As the sky grew lighter, Martha began to make out more details about the new arrivals. The warrior who was walking among the bodies appeared to be older than most of the men who had participated in the attack. His movements were deliberate and careful, and she had the impression that he was conducting some kind of examination or assessment of the scene. The other riders remained mounted, but they were not simply waiting passively. Martha could hear them talking among themselves, and occasionally one of them would call out to the man on foot. She wished desperately that she could understand their language, because their conversations might give her some clue about their intentions and whether they posed a new threat to her survival. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Martha lay among the dead, fighting against her body's natural urges to move, to breathe normally, to react to the stress of her situation. The sun was rising higher, and she could feel its warmth beginning to penetrate the cold that had settled into her bones during the long night. But with the warmth came new problems, as the bodies around her began to attract more flies and other insects. The warrior who had been walking among the bodies suddenly stopped, very close to where Martha lay. She could sense him standing over her, and she had the terrifying feeling that he was studying her specifically. For long moments he remained motionless, and Martha began to wonder if he had somehow detected that she was still alive. Then, without warning, the warrior spoke directly to her in English. "I know you are alive," he said in a voice that was surprisingly gentle. "You need not fear me. I am not here to harm survivors." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. Her carefully maintained composure nearly shattered as she realized that her deception had been discovered. Every instinct screamed at her to jump up and run, but a deeper wisdom told her that this man could easily overtake her if he meant her harm. Instead, she forced herself to remain motionless, hoping against hope that he was somehow mistaken about her condition. "You have been very clever," the warrior continued, still speaking in English. "To remain still for so long, to control your breathing so well, these are not easy things. But I have been watching you for some time now, and I can see the small signs that show you still live. Your body moves slightly when you breathe. Your eyelids flutter sometimes when insects crawl on your face." Martha's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. This warrior spoke English well, better than any Native American she had encountered during their journey. His voice carried none of the hostility or aggression she would have expected from someone associated with the war party that had destroyed her family. But she still could not bring herself to trust him enough to reveal that she was indeed alive. "My name is Standing Bear," the warrior said, apparently addressing her even though she had not responded to his previous words. "I am a chief of the Northern Cheyenne, but I was not with the war party that attacked your wagon train. I came here to see what had happened, and to understand why my young warriors chose to kill so many innocent people." Martha continued to lie still, but her mind was working furiously to understand this new development. If this man was telling the truth, then he might represent hope rather than a new threat. But how could she know whether to trust him? And even if he meant her no immediate harm, what were his intentions regarding her ultimate fate? "I can see that you do not trust me," Standing Bear continued. "This is wisdom given what you have experienced. But consider this. If I meant to kill you, I would have already done so. I would not need to speak with you first. I would not need to convince you to reveal yourself." The logic of his words was undeniable, but Martha had learned over the past 2 days that logic and survival were not always the same thing. She forced herself to continue playing dead, even though the strain of maintaining her deception was becoming almost unbearable. Her muscles ached from remaining motionless. Her throat was parched despite her recent drink from the creek, and the emotional stress of the situation was threatening to overwhelm her self-control. Standing Bear moved away from her position, and Martha could hear him speaking to his companions in the Cheyenne language. The conversation continued for several minutes, and Martha had the impression that they were discussing what to do about her. She caught a few words that sounded familiar from her previous encounters with Native Americans, but not enough to understand the substance of their discussion. When Standing Bear returned to her side, he knelt down close to where she lay. Martha could feel his presence even though she kept her eyes closed, and she was acutely aware of how vulnerable she was in this position. If he chose to harm her, she would have no way to defend herself or escape. "I will tell you something that may help you decide whether to trust me," Standing Bear said quietly. "The war party that attacked your people was led by my son, Running Wolf. He is young and angry, and he believes that all white settlers are his enemies. I do not share his hatred, but I also could not stop him from following what he believed was the warrior's path." This revelation stunned Martha. The man speaking to her was the father of the warrior who had led the attack that killed her family. By all logic, this should make him her enemy, but something in his voice suggested that the relationship between father and son was more complicated than simple agreement and support. "Running Wolf and his warriors took captives back to our village," Standing Bear continued. "They will be treated according to our customs, which means they will not be harmed if they accept their new lives among us. But you, if I leave you here, will surely die." The prairie is not a forgiving place for someone alone and without supplies. Martha felt her carefully maintained control beginning to slip. The strain of remaining motionless for so long, combined with the emotional impact of learning about her fellow captives and her own desperate situation, was pushing her beyond her ability to continue the deception. Despite her best efforts, she felt a single tear escape from her closed eyes and roll down her cheek. That tiny movement was enough to confirm what Standing Bear had already suspected. He had been watching her carefully, looking for exactly this kind of sign that would prove she was alive. When he saw the tear, he spoke again, this time with even greater gentleness. "There is no shame in crying for your family," he said. "They were good people who did not deserve what happened to them. But you are alive, and that means you still have choices to make about your future. You can continue to lie here and hope that someone will rescue you, but we both know that is unlikely. Or you can trust me to help you survive this terrible situation." The weight of exhaustion, grief, and desperation finally overwhelmed Martha's ability to maintain her deception. Without quite making a conscious decision to do so, she found herself whispering the first words she had spoken since the attack began. "Please," she whispered, so quietly that the word was barely audible. "Please don't hurt me." Those two simple words, spoken in a voice cracked with thirst and emotion, changed everything. Standing Bear had been certain that she was alive, but hearing her actual voice made her humanity undeniable. In that moment, she transformed from a potential enemy, or burden, into a person who desperately needed help. "I will not hurt you," Standing Bear replied immediately. "You have my word as a chief of the Cheyenne people. But you must understand that I cannot simply leave you here or take you back to white settlements. Both of those choices would create serious problems for my people." Martha slowly opened her eyes and looked directly at Standing Bear for the first time. What she saw was a man perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and a face marked by years of outdoor living. His eyes showed intelligence and compassion, but also the kind of hardness that came from a lifetime of difficult decisions. He was wearing traditional Cheyenne clothing, but it was not decorated for war, and he carried no weapons that she could see. "What will happen to me?" Martha asked, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, as if he were considering several different answers to her question. When he finally spoke, his words were careful and measured. "I cannot return you to your own people without creating the risk that you will lead soldiers back to our village," he said. "And I cannot leave you here to die because that would be dishonorable. The only choice that protects both you and my people is to bring you back to our village, where you can live among us as the other captives do." The word captive sent a chill through Martha's heart, but she forced herself to think clearly about her situation. She was alone in the wilderness, hundreds of miles from safety, with no resources and no realistic hope of rescue. Whatever Standing Bear was offering her, it was probably better than the certain death that awaited her if she remained where she was. "Will I be a prisoner?" she asked. "You will be what you choose to be," Standing Bear replied. "Our people have many customs for bringing outsiders into our community. Some captives choose to resist and remain forever apart from us. Others learn our ways and become valued members of our tribe. Your fate will depend largely on the choices you make." Martha looked around at the scene of devastation that surrounded them. Her family was dead, her former life was over, and her chances of returning to white civilization were virtually non-existent. The choice Standing Bear was offering her was not the one she would have wanted, but it appeared to be the only one that offered any hope of continued existence. "If I go with you," she said slowly, "what will be expected of me?" Standing Bear smiled for the first time since their conversation had begun. It was an expression that transformed his face and made him seem less like a feared Cheyenne chief and more like a grandfather concerned about the welfare of a young person in need. "First," he said, "you will need to learn to survive. And then, if you choose, you will have the opportunity to learn what it means to be part of a people who are very different from your own." The journey to the Cheyenne village took 3 days, and for Martha, it was like traveling into an entirely different world. Standing Bear had provided her with a horse and basic supplies, but more importantly, he had given her something she had thought was lost forever: hope for a future beyond the nightmare of the Wagon train massacre. During the ride across the Nebraska prairie, Standing Bear told her about the complex political situation that had led to the attack on her wagon train. The Northern Cheyenne were facing increasing pressure from white settlers and the United States Army, and many young warriors believed that violence was the only way to protect their traditional way of life. His son, Running Wolf, was among the most militant of these young men, convinced that every white settler represented a threat to their people's survival. Running Wolf lost his wife and infant daughter to soldiers 2 winters ago, Standing Bear explained as they rode side by side across the endless grassland. They were camped with a peaceful band that had done nothing to provoke attack, but the soldiers came anyway. Since that day, my son has seen all white people as enemies to be destroyed. Martha struggled to understand how someone who had suffered such a terrible loss could then inflict the same kind of pain on others. But as Standing Bear continued to explain the history of conflict between his people and the advancing American frontier, she began to realize that the cycle of violence and revenge had been building for many years, with atrocities committed by both sides. "I do not excuse what happened to your family," Standing Bear said when he saw her struggling with these difficult concepts. "But I want you to understand that among my people, you will meet others who have lost everything they loved. To white soldiers and settlers, your survival and acceptance among us will depend partly on your ability to see past the hatred that grief can create." As they traveled, Martha learned basic words in the Cheyenne language and began to understand some of their customs. Standing Bear explained that captives were often adopted into families that had lost members to warfare or disease. If she proved herself worthy of acceptance, she could eventually become a full member of the tribe, with all the rights and responsibilities that status entailed. "But this transformation requires more than simply learning our language and our ways," Standing Bear warned her. "You must also be willing to let go of your old identity and embrace a new understanding of who you are." Many captives find this the most difficult part of their new life among us. The Cheyenne village, when they finally reached it, was larger and more complex than Martha had expected. More than 200 people lived in dozens of beautifully decorated teepees arranged in family clusters along the banks of a small river. Children played in the water while women worked on various tasks, and men tended to horses or crafted weapons and tools. It looked like a thriving community, not the savage encampment she had been taught to imagine. Martha's arrival created considerable interest among the villagers. Many people emerged from their teepees to watch as Standing Bear led her through the camp, and she could hear conversations in the Cheyenne language that she assumed were about her presence. Some faces showed curiosity, others displayed hostility, and a few seemed to express sympathy for her obvious distress. Standing Bear took her directly to his own teepee, where she met his wife, Grey Dove, a dignified woman perhaps 10 years younger than her husband. Grey Dove had obviously been expecting Martha's arrival because she had already prepared a place for her to sleep and had gathered clothing that would be more appropriate than the blood-stained dress Martha had been wearing since the attack. "Grey Dove lost a daughter to the same sickness that took many of our people 3 years ago," Standing Bear explained. "She has agreed to take you into our family and teach you what you need to know to survive among us. But you should understand that this arrangement is temporary until we can determine your ultimate place in our community."
That first evening in the Cheyenne village was one of the most difficult experiences of Martha's life.
Everything around her was strange and unfamiliar, from the food they served her, to the language they spoke, to the customs they expected her to follow. She found herself constantly fighting back tears as she remembered her family and the life that had been taken from her so suddenly and violently. But even in the midst of her grief and confusion, Martha was aware that she was being treated with kindness and respect. Grey Dove was patient with her fumbling attempts to communicate, and the other women in Standing Bear's extended family made obvious efforts to help her feel welcome. They brought her gifts of food and small personal items, and they spoke to her in gentle voices even when she could not understand their words. The most difficult moment came when she encountered Running Wolf for the first time. Standing Bear's son was a tall, powerfully built warrior, perhaps 30 years old, with scars on his arms and chest that spoke of many battles. When he looked at Martha, she saw none of his father's compassion or wisdom. Instead, she saw the cold hatred of someone who viewed her as the enemy, regardless of her current helpless condition. "Why did you bring this white woman here?" Running Wolf demanded of his father, speaking in English for Martha's benefit. "She is one of them, one of the people who have stolen our lands and killed our children. She does not belong among us." Standing Bear's response was calm but firm. "She belongs here because I have said she belongs here. She is under my protection, and anyone who harms her will answer to me personally. Is that understood?" The confrontation between father and son was brief but intense.
And Martha realized that her presence in the village was going to create ongoing tension within Standing Bear's own family.
Running Wolf clearly resented his father's decision to save her, and she suspected that other members of the tribe shared his feelings about the wisdom of allowing a white captive to live among them. Over the following weeks, Martha began the difficult process of learning to survive in her new environment. Grey Dove taught her how to prepare traditional Cheyenne foods, how to make and repair clothing using traditional methods, and how to perform the many daily tasks that kept the village functioning. The work was physically demanding and often tedious, but Martha threw herself into it with determination, knowing that her usefulness to the community would partly determine whether she would be accepted or eventually rejected. Learning the Cheyenne language proved to be one of her greatest challenges. The sounds and structure were completely different from anything she had ever heard, and she found herself struggling to master even basic concepts. But Grey Dove was a patient teacher, and gradually Martha began to make progress in understanding and speaking her new language. Perhaps even more difficult than learning practical skills was beginning to understand the complex social structure of Cheyenne society. The tribe was governed by a council of chiefs who made decisions based on consensus rather than individual authority. Family relationships were defined differently than in white society, with extended kinship networks playing crucial roles in determining an individual's status and responsibilities. Martha also had to learn to navigate the complicated relationships that existed between different factions within the village. There were those who, like Standing Bear, believed in trying to find peaceful solutions to the conflicts with white settlers and the American government. There were others, like Running Wolf, who believed that only continued warfare could preserve their people's independence and traditional way of life. And there were still others who advocated for accommodation and gradual assimilation into white society. As autumn approached, Martha faced her first major test of acceptance within the Cheyenne community. A group of Army Scouts had been seen in the area, and there was concern that they might be tracking the village. Some tribal members argued that Martha's presence created additional danger, since she might try to signal the soldiers or provide them with information about the village's location and defenses. The debate about what to do with Martha took place during a formal council meeting, and Standing Bear allowed her to speak in her own defense. Using the Cheyenne language skills she had been developing, Martha addressed the tribal leaders directly for the first time. "I know that some of you see me as your enemy," she said, speaking slowly and carefully to make sure her words were understood. "I know that my people and your people have done terrible things to each other, but I am not the same person who came west in a wagon train. That person died with her family on the prairie. The person who stands before you now has learned to live as you live, to work as you work, to speak as you speak." She paused, looking around the circle of faces that would determine her fate. Some showed sympathy, others remained impassive, and a few still displayed obvious hostility. "If you choose to send me away, I will go without complaint," Martha continued. "But if you allow me to stay, I promise that I will never betray your trust or bring harm to your people. I have nowhere else to go and no other family except the one you have given me." The council deliberated for hours before reaching their decision. When Standing Bear finally announced their verdict, Martha felt as if her life was beginning again for the second time. "The council has decided that you have proven your commitment to our people and our ways," he said. "You will be formally adopted into our tribe with the name Quiet Strength, in recognition of your courage during the attack on your wagon train and your determination to build a new life among us." The adoption ceremony took place 3 days later, and it was unlike anything Martha had ever experienced. She was given new clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and her hair was styled according to Cheyenne custom. Grey Dove spoke words that formally made Martha her daughter, and Standing Bear declared that she was now under the protection of his family and clan. As the ceremony concluded, Martha looked around at the faces of the people who had become her new family and community. She thought about her parents and siblings, whose memory she would always carry with her. But she also felt genuine gratitude for the chance to continue living and to find meaning in this unexpected new existence. Running Wolf was not present at the adoption ceremony, and Martha knew that his acceptance would be much harder to earn than the formal recognition of the tribal council. But she had learned to take challenges one day at a time, and she was prepared to prove herself worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. Years later, when Martha had become a respected member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe and had children of her own who grew up speaking both English and Cheyenne, she would sometimes tell them about the morning when a single whispered word had changed the entire course of her life. She would explain how sometimes the worst tragedies can become the beginning of unexpected blessings, and how survival sometimes requires us to become someone completely different from who we thought we were. The woman who had once been Martha Collins never returned to white civilization, but the woman known as Quiet Strength found a richness and purpose in her life among the Cheyenne that she had never imagined possible. She learned that identity is not something fixed and permanent, but rather something that can be rebuilt from the ground up when circumstances demand it. And she discovered that family is not just about blood relationships, but about the people who choose to love and protect you when you have lost everything else. In the end, Martha's survival of the Wagon Train Massacre became more than just a story about escaping death. It became a story about transformation, acceptance, and the remarkable human capacity to build new meaning from the ashes of old certainties. Her whispered plea for mercy had not just saved her life, it had opened the door to an entirely different understanding of what it means to be alive.